What is going on, everybody? Welcome to or back to Ryder's Record Collection. My name is Carl. This is going to be a different video for me today. I want to talk about some podcasts. This could sort of be tips, if you will, or just different podcasts that I recommend that you listen to. I am fortunate enough in my daily life to be able to listen to a lot of music. My favorite thing, get home at the end of the day, is popping a record on and hanging out and relaxing. But throughout the workday, I am fortunate enough to have a job where I can have headphones in and do my own thing, jam in music or listen to a podcast. I've found that there are times where I just don't want to listen to music, and I, like to throw on a podcast and switch it up. So here are 5 podcasts that I recommend. These are all going to be music-related podcasts. So here we go. Without any further ado, I want to kick it off with a podcast called Rivals, Music's Greatest Feuds. I got the Apple Podcast preview page open up here, so I'll read the little description that Apple does. And this is Beatles versus Stones, Biggies versus Tupac, Kanye versus Taylor. Who do you choose, and what does that say about you? Actually, what do these endlessly argued about pop rivals say about you? Music opinions bring out passionate debate in people, and music journalists / critics Stephen Hayden and Jordan Runtagh know this firsthand. They're both obsessed with the biggest as well as the most obscure rivalries in music history, and each week they'll break down the details of different colorful feud and attempt to figure out why many of our favorite pop and rock stars can't seem to get along. So this whole podcast, they dive into rivalries and bands or between musicians. They've had some really good episodes about the Eagles, the people from the band, Katy Perry versus Taylor Swift. A lot of music that I really listen to, being a rock and classic rock guy, along with a lot of music that I wouldn't normally listen to. Some other topics they cover is Dr. Dre versus Eazy-E, Sting versus The Police. All their episodes are about an hour, and some of them are two-parters. The Beatles are two-parters. They did a really good one on the Kinks, the two Davis brothers. And just a really good, fun podcast to talk about rivalries in music and music history. And, you spend an hour listening to something about Katy Perry and Taylor Swift, and you kind of end it, and you're like, man, I could listen to some Katy Perry, Taylor Swift, and that's not my type of music. So Rivals is the first podcast I would recommend. So the next podcast I want to recommend is called Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Induction Vault. This is a really good podcast because this introduces me to a lot of artists that I haven't heard of and reminds me of a lot of artists that I have heard of. And the bio on Apple Podcasts for this is, each year, rock's highest honor, induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, is bestowed upon a handful of artists, cementing their legacy for eternity. That night, they are celebrated by their peers and the contemporary artists they have influenced. All share mutual admiration for these legends who have dedicated their lives to rock and roll. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Induction Vault gives unfiltered access to these iconic speeches from the biggest names in music, ranging from the Beatles to NWA. So this podcast, what they do is they have the person who is inducting a particular artist into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the speech that that particular band gives. Some really good ones, or some examples, are Bruce Springsteen inducting Bob Dylan in 1988, Pete Townshend of The Who inducting the Rolling Stones in 1989, Elton John inducting Leon Russell in 2011. Leon Russell is a guy that I did not know who he was. I've seen his albums in many record stores, never had any idea. Listen to that podcast and I know who Leon Russell is now. Kid Duck inducting Lynyrd Skynyrd, and Tom Morello, Rage Against the Machine, and The Edge of U2 inducting The Clash. It's really fun. You get to hear artists that you really like and really care about inducting other artists that they really like and they really care about. So it's a very good podcast to, like I said, be reminded of music you might not have listened to in a while, or be turned on to new music. The one downside of this podcast that I will say is that they don't play any of the musical performances after the fact. But to hear the speeches and to hear the artists that are being inducted accept their inductions, it's very cool. It's a very nice podcast to listen to. So the next podcast that I listen to that I like to share with everybody is called Record Store Society. This is a really good source of me to find new music. The people on this podcast talk about types of music that I'm not really into, but they have a very wide range of music that they enjoy. So for this, the Apple Podcast preview, it says it's time to visit your favorite local record store, a place where music fans meander aimlessly, spend countless hours flipping through used records, and discuss the mutiny of favorite B-sides, best live albums, and anything else music related. If you have any questions, you can always find Tara and Seth behind the counter, ready to dispense a recommendation or tell you about a recent discovery. Join Record Store Society every Friday to see what's new or just hang around for some music talk. This is a spoof record store, basically. It's cool. They started out, they have like a mini conversation of what they're going to talk about that day, and they do what they call the high fidelity game. And they have 3 people on there. It's this guy, Seth, and Tara, and they always have a guest person and different topics for the day. So one hit wonders, best live albums, best punk albums, things like that. So for me, it's a very good way to discover new music. I like this podcast a lot too, because it seems like a regular everyday conversation. They're not afraid to drop the F-bomb. They're not afraid to call each other out for a choice that somebody else doesn't agree with. And the coolest thing about this podcast is at the end of the day, when the record store closes, they tell you what they would recommend, much like your local record store would recommend something to you. So Record Store Society is another really good podcast that I recommend. This next podcast, I don't tune into every week. I don't listen to every new episode. I sort of pick and choose what I want from them. It's more of an interviewing podcast, music discussion podcast, but this is Broken Record with Rick Rubin, Malcolm Gladwell, Bruce Headlam, and Justin Richmond. And the Apple Podcast preview says, from Rick Rubin, Malcolm Gladwell, Bruce Headlam, and Justin Richmond, the musicians you love talk about their life, inspiration, and craft. And it's just, different people talking about their life. There's some really good ones. I've listened to Andre 3000 from Outkast. Just different people come on here and have discussions, ask questions, promote their new albums. It's very interesting. And I gotta say, Rick Rubin, he could do ASMR. He has the calmest, coolest, most level-headed, collected voice. It's pretty insane. Like I said, this is more of an interview podcast. I don't listen to this all the time, but I do. If there's an artist that I like, I will tune into that episode. The last 3 of them I adamantly love and I listen to every week when they come out. But this one, it's more of a dealer's choice, if you will. So the next one that I want to talk about is not one that I necessarily get musical recommendations from. This is more of a pulpy, true crime, fictionalized podcast based on real life events and real life people. This is called the 27 Club, and the Apple Podcast preview says, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, and many more musical icons all died at the age of 27. Scandalous, tortured, dramatic, and incredibly talented, these artists torched a wild path to their early graves and shifted and shaped our culture along the way. 27 Club tells their stories. Season 1 tells the story of Jimi Hendrix in 12 episodes. Season 2 tells the story of Jim Morrison of The Doors in 12 episodes. And now Season 3 brings you the story of Janis Joplin. 27 Club is hosted and created by Jake Brennan, host of the award-winning and true music and true crime podcast Disgraceland. 27 Club is not a journalistic podcast. It is an entertainment podcast inspired by true events. And, certain dialogue, certain things that they talk about in the podcast might not be true, but it is really good. Every time there's a new episode of this, I tune in. I really enjoyed this podcast. The season 1 and season 2 were a wild ride. It makes you realize how crazy and how excessive life was for people like Jimi Hendrix and Jim Morrison, and the trials and tribulations, some of the backwater unknown stories that they get into. But my advice with this podcast, if you do listen to this, is take it with a grain of salt, because it is somewhat fictionalized. It is based on true events, but it is somewhat fictionalized. So there's a crazy story about Jimi Hendrix getting kidnapped and the New York mob coming to save him. Crazy stories about Jim Morrison kissing a girl on the side of the road and getting arrested for it. And just, you know, I'm in the middle of the one with Janis Joplin right now, so it's very entertaining. So those are 5 podcasts that I recommend, I enjoy, that I use for new music. So take this as, I guess, a tip if you want. Like I said, it's not the normal record conversation that we have, but it's something that I figured I'd share. If you like this sort of style of video, I will share some more podcasts that I'm really into. As much as I love music, I like stories and I like learning new things. So podcasts are a good way for me to do that. So if you like this, please let me know in the comments. If you recommend any podcasts, also please let me know in the comments, because I'm all about checking out new things. Here are 5 podcasts that I recommend, and I am Carl. This is Ryder's Record Collection. If you like this video, please throw it a like. If you like the channel, please subscribe, and I'll have some more content out for you guys soon. Cheers.